This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a really strong and really affordable collection of books about animal studies. I know that the series is currently commissioning new titles, so if you're working on a book about animal studies in whatever discipline, do consider reaching out to the editors of the series to see if your work might be a good fit. And also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today I'm very pleased to introduce you to two guests. Rhys Borchert is a PhD candidate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Arizona in the United States, and Aliya Dewey is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Philosophy and Artificial Intelligence Research Center at the Friedrich-Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. Today we're going to be discussing Rhys and Aliya's paper In Praise of Animals, which was the winner of the inaugural essay prize competition of the Philosophy of Animal Minds and Behaviour Association. In Praise of Animals was published in the journal Biology and Philosophy in 2023. Welcome to the podcast, Rhys.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
And welcome to the podcast, Aliya.
Thanks, Josh. Happy to be here too.
So could you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, I think the origin of this project came actually when I was in a reading group for this book, Unprincipled Virtue by Nomi Arpali. And I think before reading that book, I had a kind of ordinary conception of moral responsibility, praise, and blame, which goes back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant, which is something like, in order to be praiseworthy for doing something, it's not just that you have to do the morally right thing, but you have to somehow be motivated by doing or acting in accordance with morality. The way that Kant put it was something like, you had to act out of respect for the moral law. And this is kind of an intellectual condition for moral responsibility that's pretty standard in philosophy. But in this book, what Arpali does is she argues against this kind of account. And she argues in favor of what's called a reasons responsive account, which is considered an anti-intellectual account, where there's less demands on the intellectual or cognitive components and more demands about sensitivity to what she calls reasons. And so it's a reasons responsive account. And as I was reading this book, I first started to feel convinced by her arguments and started thinking that the ordinary Kantian account was wrong. But then I also had the thought that, well, when we get rid of these intellectualist components, it seems that this account would invite in some non-human animals into the picture. Yet it seemed like when we were looking at reasons responsive theorists in general, they didn't seem to be open to this possibility, or they didn't really even consider it or entertain it.
So it seems that a lot of what you're saying depends upon this idea of a reasons responsive account of praiseworthiness. So what is a reasons responsive account of praiseworthiness?
A reasons responsive account of praiseworthiness says that an agent is praiseworthy for performing some action, just in case the reasons that explain why they were motivated to act in the way they did are also the reasons that explain why the action is right.
And so could you explain how this leads to the conclusion that animals could be praiseworthy?
So a reasons responsive account suggests that animals can be praiseworthy because it lowers the bar for what it takes to be praiseworthy. But behavior has to be sensitive to a good-making feature of the action. That's enough. So the example we use in the paper, which is Rhys's example, is of a mother cat who saves her kittens from a fire at great cost to herself. And in this case, it seems like a great example of praiseworthiness, to us at least. And this is true sort of regardless of whether the cat has any sort of moral concepts. We assume they don't. The reason being that there's an explanation for why she did this. She went into the fire to pull out her kittens because her kittens were at danger, right? The reason that explains her behavior, though, is also the reason that makes her behavior right? It's the fact that her kittens were in danger that makes her action right. So there just needs to be an equivalence between those two kinds of reasons. That's how I got in the project, actually, because it can be sort of strange and anthropomorphic, or can seem that way, to explain animal behavior in terms of reasons. But I don't think it's all that strange, and we try to argue in the paper that that is actually an okay thing to do.
It's interesting what you say about that being an explanation for why the cat is acting in the way that she is. It seems that there could also be other kinds of explanations for the way the cat is behaving, other than the fact that she is responding to these right reasons.
Yeah, so there are different kinds of explanation, and there may be some compatibility between these different kinds. Here's a kind of explanation that we don't like very much, which is just to appeal to instincts, right? That there's some kind of base maternal instinct that the mother cat has, and then that's what causes her to go into the fire. An account like that appeals to instinct tries to diminish this relationship between the cat and her reasons. And we don't think it does very well to the extent that it does that, right? If instinct is just this sort of hardwired response to stimuli, a mother cat has never faced that particular situation. She's not going to have this brute response. Instead, she has to be sensitive to the features of the situation, which are reasons. And so insofar as you have a behavioral explanation that's compatible with the flexibility of the behavior, that flexibility is going to be sensitivity, right? And it's a sort of very thin notion of reasons responsiveness. It's just sensitivity to these features in the environment. And because these seem to be very unique behaviors for very unique situations, a sensitivity, reasons responsiveness kind of explanation seems appropriate. These instinct explanations seem to dismiss the phenomenon more than actually explain them.
So do you think that lots of animals are in principle praiseworthy because they have this ability to respond to reasons? Or is this something that we're only going to find with the so-called higher animals?
On the account that we give, there could be two different ways that you could argue that non-human animals are praiseworthy or could be praiseworthy. One is to sort of accept certain kind of cognitive demands and then show that certain kind of higher animals can meet those demands. But the account that we give, it still has cognitive demands, but they're not specific to kind of human. So it's not that, well, we're lowering what it means to reflect, or we're kind of lowering the standard of what it means to engage in deliberation or something like that. Rather, it's saying that these standard accounts overplay the significance of reflection and deliberation when we're attributing praise to the actions of human beings. And actually, they don't play that significant of a role. So on the view that we advocate for, it's not just that maybe apes, dolphins, elephants, something like that, maybe these can be praiseworthy, but rather it's a more general account. Now, how far down that goes is kind of beyond me. I don't really know enough about animal science to know, but it seems that the view that we've argued for, at the very least, kind of mammals in general would seem to be candidates for our account. And so in general, kind of at least mammal behavior would be safe candidates for actions that might be praiseworthy.
I would say that it can be extended to a lot of mammals, probably. But I would probably be more ambitious and say it would extend to birds, and probably very far down implies some kind of directionality across the tree of life.
But if it's a matter of responding to the right kinds of reasons, presumably for some less psychologically sophisticated animals, there's only going to be a very limited number of reasons that they might be able to respond to. So it's one thing to say, you and I can recognize others are suffering, we can recognize others are embarrassed, we can recognize others are, etc., etc., etc. Maybe dogs and other social mammals can recognize some of these things. But then when we get to the less sophisticated animals, they might have much less ability to recognize the kinds of reasons that are important.
Yeah, that's right. And when we're talking about reasons, for the sophisticated Kantian intellectualist account, the recognitions of reasons is typically understood as recognition as moral reasons. And so it has to be something like, well, they thought what they were doing was the right thing to do. That has to be part of the explanation for their behavior in order for them to be counted as praiseworthy. On our account, it's morally relevant reasons. So it's not that you have to be motivated out of respect for some sort of moral principle, but if you're motivated out of the thought that, well, if I do this, this will prevent pain, or this will prevent suffering, or this will help in some way. So it's about the extent to which morally relevant reasons can explain their behavior. So you're absolutely right that as you go down, say, to insects or something like that, when we're thinking about explanations for their behavior, at that level, it's probably just more sort of brute stimuli, sort of brute kind of relatively simple lawhood relations between their external stimuli and the behavior, but it gets more sophisticated. So I think when we're thinking about the threshold on our view of where animals can enter the game of being praiseworthy, it's whether or not morally relevant reasons can explain their behavior. And we should say it's not just explain their behavior in any way, but it has to be explaining their behavior in a way that explains why they're motivated to act.
Let me take a step back a bit, because I think some people might be listening and thinking, this all sounds like a decent argument for the idea that animals can be praiseworthy. But then let me ask the difficult question, why does that matter? Why does it matter whether or not animals can be praiseworthy?
I think a lot of the literature in philosophy, especially like the ethical literature in philosophy on non-human animals, has really pitted them as these subjects or this sort of recipients of human action, as sort of receptacles of utility, maybe bearers of rights and so on. But it seems to me I think it seems to both Rhys and I that there's a lot more to animal life and human and non-human animal interactions than just that. If you have a pet, a lot of your life involves a navigation between agents, right? Like you have to sort of negotiate with your dog. And having concepts like praiseworthiness and even blameworthiness can really help pick out salient and important features of those dynamics. And I think it's important, just like in a lot of decolonial philosophy, right, to start to recognize the agency in others. I think there's like an important need to do this with non-human animals too, right? Extending agency is part of the moral sphere.
I'm glad you mentioned the issue of blameworthiness, because I'll come clean. One of the reasons I've always been quite worried about the idea of animals being praiseworthy is that I think we have very good reason to resist the conclusion that animals are blameworthy. If animals are blameworthy, that means that they're doing something wrong when they hurt other animals, and a lot of animals hurt other animals. Does your account suggest that animals, because they could be praiseworthy, could also be blameworthy?
So this is a good thing to bring up, and it's something that we've encountered a lot sort of in early drafts and discussions with people. This was a very salient thing. And it's actually in the literature a few times, sort of preemptively, people will say, well, non-human animals can't be moral agents because of the consequences of if they're blameworthy. But one thing we'll point out is that very often this kind of argument relies on intuitions about how weird it would be to punish non-human animals. Like the most flat-footed one is something like, what, you're saying we should go put lions in prison or something like that? And so in the paper, we make a distinction between sort of a judgment of blameworthiness, an act of blame, and an act of punishing, something like that. So we point out that even in the case of praising, and praiseworthiness, it's not a straightforward implication from you judge an action to be praiseworthy or you judge an action to be blameworthy to you should do a certain kind of action. It depends on the situation. So our account does imply that in certain situations, animals are in fact blameworthy. But we think that a lot of the attempts to try to undermine our account are based on too quick of implications from that to what we should do. Like our account, for instance, does not imply that we have to intervene in nature in some kind of way, or put non-human animals in prison or something. Like that's not our view, because those are other considerations that you'd have to supplement the fact that they're blameworthy for acting in a certain way with other considerations, and we would reject those other considerations.
I'd like to just add that if you follow the line about blameworthiness, even if, like Rhys says, you should suspend any further inferences about blame, it gets tricky, right? Because our account is a sensitivity account. So with lions who have to kill to survive, right? It's unclear how to even start looking for sensitivity, right? To what makes those actions bad, right? They just have no sensitivity to that. They couldn't, right? There's very good reasons why a lion hasn't acquired that capability to be sensitive to that. Already right there, it's unclear how the account gets off the ground. Whereas for something like my dog who tears up my couch and dreads me coming home and is hiding, I think they're sensitive to the bad making features of that action, at least a little bit. And in that case, it does seem a lot more intuitive to say that they're blameworthy. Of course, you might think about whether that's a productive response, and these are contextual considerations that go into the further question of blame. But when there's actual sensitivity to the features of the situation, then even blameworthiness starts to look a little bit more intuitive.
I see what you mean. So there's at least two things going on here, as I understand it. One is this question about which kinds of wrong-making or right-making reasons animals actually are sensitive to, and of course that's contextual. But the other is this distinction between being blameworthy and it being appropriate to blame them.
Mm-hmm.
I like that distinction. I like the sound of it. But could I ask you to explain a little bit more what's going on here? Because I suppose if we are separating blameworthiness from the appropriateness of blaming, I'm losing sight a little bit of what blameworthiness is anymore.
I think one way to think about the account that we're giving is blameworthiness determines whether or not certain attitudes are fitting or whether a judgment is correct. So just as an example, if a Roomba is moving around your room and bumps into your toe and it sort of hurts your toe, and you think, what a bad Roomba. Like, you get mad at the Roomba. That's weird. That's not fitting. That's not correct. It's just not an apt kind of thing for you to get mad at. And what I think is weird is that the views that we're arguing against think, well, that should be your attitude towards all non-human animals, is that you should treat them the same way the Roomba is. You might be upset that your toe hurts, but you can't be upset at them because they're not moral agents. So I think at the very least, it's that kind of thing where if we're right, then there are certain behaviors and actions of non-human animals where that kind of reactive attitude, as it's sometimes called, or just a judgment, is in fact fitting. And it could be that action or the fittingness of that attitude might ground or explain or justify some further action. So if it's a person who steps on your toe deliberately, first you would have a fitting judgment that this person's kind of a jerk, but then that might justify you in intervening and telling them that you think they're a jerk, or that you acting in a way that would express your dissatisfaction or maybe try to change their behavior and things like that. So there is a connection. There still is a connection between blameworthiness and blame. We're just pointing out that it's not as straightforward as sometimes the way that the objections are couched kind of seem to assume the straightforward connection.
I think some people listening to this might think that a lot of what you're saying seems quite straightforward and quite intuitive, that we should respond to animals in these kinds of ways. So why do you think philosophers analysing praiseworthiness have always taken it for granted that animals can't be praiseworthy?
So I think if you're looking at the philosophical tradition, in general, philosophers like to focus on idealized cases, and they use idealized cases to strip away the unnecessary details and just focus on what matters. And then construct their theories from there. And very often that's a good thing to do. But when you're thinking about an idealized case for human behavior, philosophers tend to think, well, in an idealized case, like if I had all the time, I would reflect and I would deliberate and there would be all this going on, and then I would act. And so they use that as the starting point for their theories about moral responsibility in general. And I think that is why, with a philosophical tradition, it's just very standard to think that those are actually conditions of moral responsibility, praise and blame. But if instead you start with unidealized cases where we're not imagining a perfect human agent, then we can see that actually these conditions about reflection and deliberation aren't as important, and that helps highlight the features. And I think that's precisely what Nomi Arpali does in her book. She focuses on agents who act in ways that are contrary to their opinions about how they act. So her example is Huck Finn. There's a point in the story, and obviously it depends, if we're doing a philosophical analysis, it depends on how we fill in the details, but the idea is supposed to be, there's a point in the story where he has a chance to turn Jim in, but he doesn't, in spite of the fact that he thinks he ought to. He thinks he's being a bad boy for not turning Jim in. And so we use this case where Huck Finn is clearly not an ideal moral agent. Yet it seems like he does the right thing and for the right reasons. He can't really comprehend it, but it's the fact that he's become friends with Jim and he's respectful of Jim's humanity. That explains why he doesn't turn Jim in. And so Arpali focuses on these unidealized cases or non-ideal agents in order to ground moral responsibility. And when we're thinking about that, I think that allows in non-human animals, because now we've dispensed with this intellectualist condition.
Some more motivation for why philosophers start with the idealized cases, just because it's easy to lose track of why so many smart people start with examples that don't seem so great when you're coming from outside that discipline, is to sort of go back quickly to Kant's example of, or Kant's account of praiseworthiness. I'll really simplify it. He thinks about a shopkeeper who doesn't cheat on his customers for two possible reasons. One, because he's worried about getting caught and losing business. And two, because he just wants to do the right thing by his customers. If you're working with these kinds of human, normal, everyday cases, you might point to reason as the difference-making, these sort of reflective reasons as the difference-making feature, right? Like it's the fact that he acts out of concern for the moral law that makes his action praiseworthy as opposed to self-interest. So it's a very intuitive starting point. But like Rhys said, you want to extend beyond these idealized examples. And then once you do, you get into accounts that are also intuitive, but they're motivated very differently, and they extend much further.
This repetition of intuition and intuitive reminds me of quite a striking line in the final sentences of your paper, where you write that you've come to experience a radical shift in your philosophical intuitions. Could you explain that?
In that final line, I don't think that it's just a reference to working on this project, but rather it's sort of a lifetime shift over the way that we look at non-human animals. In that line, we're kind of pointing out that if you think what we're saying is bizarre and weird, it's just like, this just can't be right. We're sort of expressing our sympathy in that regard, in the sense of it wasn't just overnight. We just started thinking about non-human animals differently. But when you do start thinking about non-human animals differently, and you start having a different relationship with non-human animals, not just in your philosophical thinking, but in your life, then a lot of what we're saying, honestly, just doesn't strike us as unintuitive. And I think you have already touched on, when we talk to non-philosophers, very often people are like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, good dogs are good. Why would someone not like that kind of view? And so that's what we were trying to express with that line.
Now, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. And listeners might have already guessed that we have a bit of a challenge here because we have 2 guests today. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask both of you the 5 quick questions, and so I must stress that they have to be quick answers. So Rhys, I'm going to ask you first. First quick question. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, Animal Liberation, Peter Singer.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Insofar as this is pro-animal scholarship, this paper.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to cheat here and say historically Gary Francione, more recently Will Kimlicka and Sue Donaldson.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Stop eating them. But also, if we're just thinking about philosophers, I think just very simply, just remember that non-human animals exist. So when you're theorizing about certain things, like it might be moral responsibility, but it could be epistemic justification. Just remember that non-human animals exist and that it's probably a good thing to think about them when you're theorizing.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Again, the obvious answer is to stop the exploitation. But I do think that it would be nice if there was less of a communication barrier, because suppose you align your attitudes in the right way, like you want to respect non-human animals, very often difficult to understand how you ought to act in a way that's respectful to animals. So I think in some kind of idealized world where we were able to break down some of those communication barriers, that would advance it beyond just mere stopping exploiting animals, but cultivating better relationships with them.
Well, what a fantastic batch of answers. So I'll now turn to Aliya. Aliya, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Also by Peter Singer, Practical Ethics.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, a paper in philosophical psychology called Anthropomorphism and Anthropectomy as Friendly Competitors. It was meant to be a defense of anthropomorphism, but I didn't quite get all the way there.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Kristen Andrews. She works in philosophy at York University. She taught a course on animal mind reading that had a lasting effect on me. And she's just been a great person to me through the years and to a lot of other people.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Not sure how to rank different important things besides don't eat them. A small thing, I really like to see vegan catering at philosophy events, especially animal related, but even otherwise. Like it infuriates me when there are not good options or there are even non-vegan options at animal related events. I think we need to push the envelope there.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think increased recognition of our joint agency. We cooperate often unintentionally with animals to create ecosystems and niches and environments, and we don't really respect or value that. But in a very important sense, there are cooperators and coordinators, and it'd be just good to see more recognition of that.
Well, thanks. So before I sign off, Rhys, what are you working on next?
Well, related to this project, I would like to, in this project, we're defending ourselves from objections throughout the paper, but I would like to write something where it's more just explaining a more thorough account of moral agency in general that incorporates non-human animals.
And how can people find out more about your work, Rhys?
Well, I have a website, rhysborchert.com. I'm also on Phil Papers. You can find me on there. My works will be posted there.
And Aliya, what are you working on next? I understand you just started a new postdoc.
Yes, that's right. I'm working on a whole bunch of things, but related to this work and a growing theme in my work is looking at the black box problem, how to adjudicate between different possible explanations of behavior when there's a lot of them, and especially in the context of animal studies where this problem is particularly difficult.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I also have a website. It's aliyadewey.com. And yeah, I keep that very up to date.
Well, thanks so much, Rhys, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to Aliya.
Thank you, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals. Please do review Knowing Animals where you found it. And if you're teaching, please do include some episodes of Knowing Animals on your reading list for students to tune into. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.